I always wanted to try cutting the wedding cake too. At the wedding I had always dreamed of since I was a child, my sister-in-law, wearing the exact same dress as me, said that today was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, as I was the star of the show. I had even chosen an expensive brand wedding dress. I couldn't forgive her just for wearing the same dress. And she was even trying to take the cake cutting from me. I could only stand and watch the scene in dismay. My name is Kelly. I am 30 years old and work as an office worker. I've really wanted to settle down, but since I wasn't able to find the perfect partner, I found myself going to a marriage advice center a lot. There, I met a man named Steve, who was 1 year older than me. And we hit it off because we shared the hobby of watching soccer. We started watching soccer and having meals together, and naturally began dating. Being with Steve always made me smile, and I enjoyed talking about soccer with him. So I thought it would be great if I could marry him. Even before I met Steve, I had been introduced to several men through the marriage office. But none of them felt right. Steve has a sister named Allison, who Steve treasures very much. And I had met her by chance several times during dates. Allison is 3 years older than Steve, 34 years old. And I think she is a bright and friendly person. From the first meeting, she smiled and asked me various questions. And I felt that she was taking good care of me as her brother's girlfriend. However, she always dressed in super miniskirts and crop tops, which wasn't really my taste, so that was a bit disappointing. Steve and Allison seemed very close. And it was clear to anyone that they cared a lot for each other. One day, a colleague told me that he had won a soccer ticket in a magazine raffle, and asked if I could take it. Since both Steve and I already had tickets, I politely declined. But he said that it would be nice if I could give it to someone else, so I accepted it. As I was wondering who to give it to, Steve asked, "My sister has been wanting to watch a soccer game for a while. Would it be okay if I took her?" So, I happily agreed. Although Allison was interested in soccer, she had never watched a game live. I thought this would be a good opportunity to get closer to Allison, as she would become my sister-in-law if we got married. And it's always better to be on good terms. On the day, Allison appeared in her usual flashy attire and was initially very excited, cheering throughout. However, she seemed tired from the long viewing, and eventually stopped watching the game and started playing with her smartphone. After silently playing with her phone for a while, she got bored and started talking to Steve continuously. And before we knew it, the first half was over. Allison said, "Is the first half finally over? I'm tired of watching the second half. I'm going home," and left her seat. Steve then naturally said, "Then I'll take you home," and I internally thought, why send her home? She could go back alone. While Steve was taking Allison home, I felt uneasy watching the game by myself. As Steve didn't come back for a while, I wondered if something had happened. And then I received an email from him saying, "My sister is feeling unwell, so I'm taking her to the hospital." Realizing that was why she was acting that way, I became worried about Allison's health. I replied to Steve, "Is Allison okay? Make sure to take her to the hospital." I was looking forward to watching the soccer game today, so it was lonely to watch it alone, but if Allison was feeling unwell, there was nothing I could do about it, so I convinced myself. Later, Steve proposed to me, and we decided to register our marriage. Initially, Allison blessed our marriage, but gradually she began to look down on me. "You look dull today. No sense of style. Kelly, you always seem so dreary," she would say nonchalantly, and Steve started to snap at me as well. He never used to do that before, but now he often picked on me and made sarcastic remarks, which left me very confused. However, since we had already registered our marriage and greeted each other's parents and relatives, I couldn't back out. I believed that once we held our wedding next month and started living together, Steve would return to his kind self, so I endured. We are still living at our respective parents' homes. but we had decided to live together after the wedding. I was all in for marriage, so I was equally excited about having a wedding. I spent a lot of time choosing my wedding dress, trying on many dresses. And even Steve helped me. Although he had become more domineering, he was serious about choosing dresses with me. I decided to splurge and buy a luxury brand wedding dress to make it a once-in-a-lifetime memory. On the day of the wedding, I was blessed by family and friends. And many people complimented my wedding dress. As I savored my happiness, Allison appeared. I was so surprised that I lost my words when I saw Allison. She was wearing the exact same wedding dress as me. Allison, why? Finally managing to speak, Allison sneered. What do you think? Don't I look beautiful? It was tough getting this dress. Allison had purposely found the exact same dress from a dress shop affiliated with our company. At the wedding, the sight of a woman other than the bride in a white dress, and the exact same one at that, was clearly bizarre. The guests whispered and looked at Allison with contempt. However, Allison was unabashed and claimed, Steve will be happier if I dress up beautifully. I wondered what she was talking about. And as I glanced at Steve's face next to me, I saw him smiling happily. Steve said with a smile, I've always thought that dress suits Allison better than you, creating an uneasy atmosphere in the venue. Allison was in a good mood, saying, I knew Steve would say that. Are you serious, Steve? I asked. Of course. Even when choosing your dress. I was always thinking about which one would suit my sister, he declared. Was that the reason he seemed so involved in choosing the dress? I regretted marrying such a man and was beyond angry, just utterly disgusted. The staff were obviously aware of the commotion. But since she was the bridegroom's sister, they couldn't just throw her out. They brought several different colored dresses for Allison to change into. But she completely ignored them. As the reception progressed, it was time for the cake cutting. As I tried to prepare myself mentally, Allison suddenly broke away from the staff. I always wanted to try cutting the cake too. Steve will be happier if I do it with him, she said as she snatched the cake knife. What are you doing? This is totally unacceptable. I reproached her, but Allison ignored me and called out. Come on, Steve, come here too. Wait, he wouldn't really go, would he? Apprehensively, I turned towards Steve, who again had a very happy expression, and obediently went to Allison's side. Steve held the cake knife with Allison, and they actually proceeded to cut the cake together, smiling at each other. I was so shocked that I was frozen for a while, but was jolted back to reality by the sighs and jeers of the guests. What are you two doing? Shouted the in-laws. Their incredibly inappropriate behavior cooled my feelings towards them to below freezing. And I felt ridiculous, so I decided to leave the wedding venue with my parents, without saying a word to Steve. I went home with my parents right after that. Later, Steve and Allison were criticized by the entire family. But they showed no remorse and did not apologize to me. Even after being scolded by the in-laws, it seemed like it had no effect on them. Steve even wondered, why did Kelly leave in the middle? Just because the dresses were the same and Allison and I cut the cake. It's no reason to get so angry. Isn't that narrow-minded? Allison also said. Exactly. Why should we be scolded? There's nothing wrong with a brother and sister being close. And there was absolutely no remorse. Moreover, Steve complained that it's sad that Kelly hates my sister. And upon hearing this from the in-laws, I decided on divorce. I immediately went to the office to get a divorce certificate. I thought about confronting Steve with the divorce papers, but I didn't want to see his face anymore, so I decided to send them instead. A few days later, when the divorce papers arrived, Steve called, screaming. What is this? Why do we have to get divorced? I replied in disbelief. Why? You still don't understand anything. It's totally unreasonable for Allison to wear the same wedding dress as the bride and even cut the cake. Why are you speaking ill of my sister? You should be able to forgive that. Steve retorted. That's what gets under my skin. I'm way more turned off by how you act than by Allison's behavior. And my affection for you has just dried up. You always seem to prioritize Allison over me. I told him calmly. What's wrong with cherishing my sister? You're the weird one. Normally, people don't divorce over such things, he yelled. It seems pointless to talk to you. Just sign the divorce papers quickly. And send them back, I said, and hung up the phone. Valuing siblings is not a bad thing, but Steve was excessive. Since he couldn't understand that, divorce was the only option. The in-laws apologized profusely to me and my parents. But since they had always been kind to me, I didn't resent them at all. Steve and Allison were to blame for everything. I should have realized how unusual Steve and Allison were way back then. I should have been more suspicious of Steve's behavior. When the three of us went to watch soccer together, Allison's behavior during the game was far from commendable. But Steve never rebuked her and naturally took her home. When she said she wanted to leave, which was strange in hindsight. I should have broken up with him sooner, but it's pointless to say that now. Later, the signed divorce papers from Steve arrived. It seemed he was reluctant at first. But the in-laws persuaded him and made him sign. The in-laws paid for the wedding costs because Steve and Allison ruined the ceremony. And they also compensated for the deposit on the new house. We were supposed to live in after the wedding. So I decided to have no further contact with those two. I thought about demanding compensation. But I just didn't want any more involvement with them, so I decided against it. Afterwards, Steve and Allison were kicked out by the in-laws and started living together. But Allison had no motivation to work and was wasteful with money. So their life quickly became difficult. Steve suggested to Allison that they should try to save a bit more, but she wouldn't listen. As their money dwindled, Steve felt a crisis and returned home to ask for help. But the in-laws, furious, said, "You two need to stop messing around. You're too selfish." And never let them back into the house. Unable to rely on anyone, the two led a life of poverty, but still, Allison refused to work, leaving Steve to work hard on his own. However, Steve, whose inappropriate behavior at the wedding had spread throughout his company, felt uncomfortable. He was getting all sorts of nasty looks, with people chatting about his sister fixation and how he picks her over his wife. And eventually, Steve couldn't deal with it anymore and decided to leave. His job search didn't go well. And the company that finally hired him was hardly a white company, forcing him to work like a horse every day. Plus, his salary was significantly lower than at his previous job. So even Allison started working part-time. But she repeatedly skipped work without notice and was soon fired. She found another part-time job, but was fired from there too for the same reason. From then on, Steve and Allison, who had always been close, started fighting frequently. Steve was constantly irritated due to stress at work and their penniless life, compounded by Allison's quick terminations from her part-time jobs. And his treatment of Allison became quite harsh. Surprised by her brother's drastic change yet inherently combative, Allison sometimes got into physical fights with Steve. Eventually, they decided to live separately. Steve led a lonely life, and Allison started working in the nightlife industry, struggling in an unfamiliar job and becoming physically and mentally worn out. Meanwhile, I, initially depressed after the divorce, recovered surprisingly quickly with the help of people around me. Steve tried to call and emailed wanting to get back together several times, but I ignored all of it. Eventually, I blocked his calls, cutting off all ties completely. I was cautious for a while, worried that Steve might come to my house. But fortunately, he never did. After some time, I found myself thinking less about Steve and his problems. And with a friend's help, I started going out with a really sweet man. Now I live with him, and we plan to get married next year. His family is very nice too. Unlike Steve, he prioritizes me and treats me well, allowing me to live a calm and peaceful life. I'm truly glad I broke up with Steve. Thinking about starting a life with him gives me chills. It was good to break up early. I'm determined to be happy from now on. And as I imagine a bright future, I'm enjoying my days.